In early 1942, Japan stood at the peak of its power. Pearl Harbor had been a crushing blow. American bases across the Pacific had fallen one after another, and inside Tokyo, many high-ranking Japanese generals confidently declared the United States too weak, too soft, and too slow to ever strike back. Some even mocked the Americans openly, believing they lacked the courage required for a long war. But just 4 months later, those same generals would watch the sky above Tokyo fill with the unmistakable roar of American engines. 16 B-25 bombers, led by a man the world soon knew as James "Jimmy" Doolittle, would do the impossible. And in doing so, they shattered the Japanese belief in American weakness forever. This is how the Doolittle Raiders changed the entire war. After Pearl Harbor, confidence inside the Japanese high command bordered on arrogance. Victories in Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies seemed to validate their belief that America was incapable of resistance. Japanese generals declared that the Americans were a nation of consumers, not warriors, too undisciplined to fight, a people who collapse in the face of hardship. To them, the Pacific War already appeared won. What they did not know, however, was that in Washington a plan was being formed, one that defied every rule of aviation and every limit of the era, a plan that would send American bombers where Japan believed no enemy aircraft could ever reach. In January 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt demanded a mission that could strike the Japanese homeland, not for military devastation, but for psychological impact. America needed a victory, a statement, the message. Enter Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a man known for fearless flying impossible ideas and a willingness to push aircraft beyond their limits. Doolittle proposed using B-25 Mitchell bombers, large twin-engine aircraft never designed to take off from an aircraft carrier. Experts told him it couldn't be done, but Doolittle refused to listen. He trained 80 hand-picked volunteers. He modified the bombers for longer range, and he rehearsed takeoffs shorter than anything the pilots had ever imagined. The Americans were preparing something Japan thought was simply impossible. On April 18, 1942, the USS Hornet carried 16 B-25s toward Japan. The plan was to get close enough for a safe launch, but before they reached the planned point, a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force. They had no choice. Doolittle ordered the bombers launched 800 miles from Japan, far beyond their intended range. Every pilot knew they would have just enough fuel to reach Japan, but not enough to return. This mission was essentially one way. Still, not a single man hesitated. Each bomber rolled down the Hornet's deck, wheels lifting off the edge with nothing but ocean beneath them. 16 aircraft took to the sky. 16 crews flew toward their fate. Just after noon, Japanese radar stations began detecting unidentified aircraft approaching the capital. No one believed it. No American bomber had ever flown this far for. No American aircraft had ever reached the Japanese mainland. But moments later, the impossible became reality. Doolittle's raiders flew directly over Tokyo and dropped their bombs. Explosions rippled across fuel depots, industrial districts, and military targets. Civilians rushed into the streets, staring upward in disbelief. Japanese officers scrambled to comprehend what they were seeing. Some Japanese generals who had mocked America's weakness now watched their own capital, the heart of the empire, burning. Psychologically, the impact was enormous. For the first time in centuries, Japan's home islands had been struck by a foreign power, and the myth of Japanese invulnerability shattered instantly. Although the physical damage was limited, the strategic impact was massive. Inside Tokyo, panic spread through the government. Admiral Yamamoto, already concerned about America's industrial strength, now realized something far worse. If American bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could reach it again. And the next time, it might be far worse. Humiliated, the Japanese High Command demanded revenge. This single raid pressured Yamamoto into launching the Midway operation, hoping to destroy the US carriers that enabled the attack. But Midway did not go as planned. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, Japan's offensive capability was permanently crippled, and the war, so confidently begun by Japan, shifted against them forever. The Doolittle Raid proved something Japanese generals never imagined. America was not weak. America would not break. America would not surrender. The raid boosted American morale massively. It terrified the Japanese high command, and it forced Japan into the chain of decisions that led to Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War. What started as a desperate American gamble ended as one of the most influential missions of World War II. 16 bombers, 80 men, and a message felt across the world. Japan's generals were wrong. America was only just beginning to fight. When the 16 American B-25 bombers cleared Tokyo's skyline on April 18, 1942, the shock inside Japan was immediate and paralyzing. Not because of the physical damage, Japan had suffered worse bombings during conflicts in China, but because of what the raid symbolized. For the first time in the modern history of the Japanese Empire, a foreign power had struck the sacred homeland. Japan's leaders had promised the population absolute safety. They assured them the Americans were defeated, broken, incapable of reaching even halfway across the Pacific. Now, that illusion was in flames. The raid forced the Japanese high command to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. America was not the enemy they imagined. Not soft, not slow, not afraid, not unwilling to die for their cause. Inside Tokyo's military and political leadership, the anger was volcanic. The humiliation felt worldwide. America crowing in celebration, newspapers cheering, Roosevelt boosting morale, only intensified the sting. The emperor demanded answers. People demanded reassurance. Generals demanded retaliation. Meetings inside the Imperial General Staff turned chaotic. One moment, officers shouted that the country had been humiliated. The next, they urged immediate retaliation to restore honor. Then came arguments over how such a breach was even possible. Japan's military doctrine had always assumed the Pacific Ocean was an impenetrable defensive barrier, a shield protecting the homeland. But now that shield was exposed as nothing more than wishful thinking. The fact that the raid originated from American aircraft carriers terrified Japan's commanders. Not the planes, the carriers. Not the bombs, the reach. The Imperial Navy had been unable to track those carriers for weeks. Their reconnaissance aircraft failed to locate them. Their radio intelligence misread their movements. Their picket ships spotted the Americans only when it was far too late. This forced Japan into a painful realization. If America could strike Tokyo once, it could strike again. And next time the damage might cripple the empire. The reaction to this was immediate. Japan needed the American carriers destroyed. Not eventually, not someday, but right now. The raid didn't merely anger Japan. It forced the nation into rushed, emotional decision-making, a dangerous shift for a country that had built its early victories on careful planning, timing, and surprise. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had already warned the government that a long war with the United States was unwinnable. He studied in America. He understood its industrial strength. He knew Americans weren't weak, just slow to awaken. Now, after Tokyo was bombed, all his fears were confirmed. Japan's war planners didn't see it that way. To them, the raid wasn't a sign of American strength. It was a sign of American desperation. They believed if the US could be forced into one decisive naval battle and lose, the war could be ended before American industry hit full speed. That belief was wrong, fatally wrong. But the Doolittle Raid pushed Japan deeper into this miscalculation. Over the next few days, Yamamoto's staff began working around the clock. Charts were pulled, naval movements were analyzed, recon routes were extended, carrier groups were reorganized. Inside the smoky war rooms, one plan emerged above all others. An attack on Midway Atoll. Midway, a tiny island northwest of Hawaii, was insignificant at first glance. But strategically it was a gateway, a location that could bait the American carriers into battle. Yamamoto believed he could set a trap, attack Midway, force the Americans to respond, surround them from multiple directions, destroy every US carrier in one decisive blow. Then, and only then, could Japan secure dominance over the Pacific. Under normal circumstances, the plan would have taken months of refinement. But now, Japan wasn't planning strategically. It was planning emotionally. The Doolittle Raid had bruised pride. Japan wanted revenge, and they wanted it immediately. Officers who questioned the timing or warned of American unpredictability were dismissed as pessimists. Politicians demanded a victory to erase the shame. Newspapers framed the raid as a minor inconvenience, but internally, everyone knew the truth. Japan had been exposed. The military doubled down. Aircraft production increased. Pilot training accelerated. Naval planners demanded more reconnaissance over the Pacific. But none of it addressed the deeper strategic problem. America wasn't Japan's past enemies. It wasn't China. It wasn't the colonial forces in Southeast Asia. It was an industrial giant capable of producing more ships, planes, tanks, fuel and ammunition than Japan could ever dream of. And now, because of the Doolittle Raid, that sleeping giant was fully awake. Japan had a very small window before American industry surged. The only hope they saw was to destroy the US fleet in one stroke. And so the emotional fallout of the raid, panic, humiliation, fear, created the momentum that carried Japan toward Midway. Over the next several weeks, Japan's intelligence services scrambled to regain their footing. Reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched in wide sweeps. Submarines patrolled the ocean lanes. Carrier groups moved silently across the Pacific. But while Japan searched for the American fleet, America was already watching Japan, listening, breaking their codes, anticipating their moves. The Doolittle Raid didn't just shock Japan, it accelerated everything, too quickly for Japan to see the trap ahead. The path to Midway had begun, and Japan had walked straight into it, without realizing the Americans already knew exactly what was coming. The shock waves from the Doolittle Raid didn't fade inside Tokyo. They grew louder with every passing day. Japan's newspapers insisted the attack was insignificant. Radio broadcasts downplayed the damage, but behind closed doors the truth was unavoidable. If 16 American bombers could reach Tokyo, America's reach was far greater than Japan ever imagined. Inside the Imperial General Staff, the humiliation settled like a heavy fog. No one wanted to admit the truth, so the officers did what prideful militaries often do: they overreacted. Meetings dragged deep into the night. Generals snapped at each other, blaming naval intelligence, carrier scouting forces, and radar operators for failing the nation. But Admiral Yamamoto saw further than the rest. He understood the deeper meaning behind the raid. The Americans were determined. They were willing to strike with incomplete information and unacceptable odds. They were willing to risk entire air crews in a mission that offered almost no chance of survival. Japan wasn't dealing with a fragile enemy. They were dealing with a country that would sacrifice anything to strike back. And that meant Japan had to respond with overwhelming force, or risk losing the psychological advantage completely. So Yamamoto pushed his plan forward, the Midway operation. It was not a new idea. He had proposed it before Pearl Harbor. He believed Midway, a small island far from Japan, was the perfect bait to lure the American carriers into a decisive showdown. But now, after the Doolittle Raid, the tone changed. This wasn't just a strategic operation. This was revenge. This was pride. This was about restoring the Emperor's confidence. This was about erasing humiliation. In other words, Japan was planning from emotion, not logic. And that is the most dangerous mindset any military can have. The Midway blueprint. Yamamoto's plan was massive and dangerously complicated. He wanted to attack Midway from multiple directions at once: a main carrier force coming from the northwest, a separate strike group approaching from the southwest, a battleship force trailing behind, submarines positioned across. The Pacific, a northern diversion force aimed at the Aleutian Islands. The idea was to confuse the Americans, divide their defences, and crush them when they rushed to defend Midway. It looked brilliant on paper, but it was built on one fatal assumption: that America didn't know Japan was coming. But America did know. In fact, they knew almost everything. The US Navy was reading Japan's messages. Analysts in Hawaii broke Japanese communications and discovered the exact date, location, and structure of the attack. Japan's greatest advantage, surprise, was gone, and Yamamoto had no idea. Overconfidence creeps in. Inside Japan's combined fleet, the mood was cocky rather than cautious. Early victories had inflated their confidence. Their carrier pilots, who fought at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the Dutch East Indies, were the most experienced in the world. They believed the Zero fighter was unbeatable. American pilots were inferior. American naval strategy was predictable. Victory seemed inevitable. So when Japanese officers raised concerns about the complexity of the operation, they were ignored. When they warned that American carriers could still be dangerous, they were dismissed. The Doolittle Raid should have made them more cautious. Instead, it made them desperate to prove their dominance again. And desperation drives recklessness. Japan's blind spots multiply. As May 1942 turned into June, Japan's intelligence network began failing in ways they didn't understand. The Americans had grown smarter. They changed radio patterns. They used deception. They mislabeled fake communications. They operated carriers silently. Japan's reconnaissance became sloppy. Weather disrupted patrol flights. Search planes covered the wrong areas. Submarines moved too slowly. The Imperial Navy drew a mental picture of American weakness based on outdated information. In their minds, the US Navy was still badly damaged. The carriers were still few. The American pilots were still inexperienced, and Midway was an insignificant dot in the ocean. Every one of those assumptions was wrong, and the Doolittle Raid had contributed to that blindness. Japan was so focused on restoring lost honor that they didn't notice they were walking deeper into danger. America prepares the battlefield. While Japan's fleet moved in scattered formations across thousands of miles, the United States prepared Midway like a fortress. The island sprouted new runways. Anti-aircraft guns were installed along the coastlines. Radar stations were reinforced. Marines dug trenches and bunkers across the sand. Fuel depots were camouflaged. A network of scouts and spotters surrounded the island. Every morning and evening, American patrol planes swept the horizon. Behind the scenes, Admiral Nimitz made the most important decision of his career: commit all available American carriers to defend Midway. Even though Japan outnumbered the US fleet, even though the plan was risky, even though losing would leave Hawaii exposed, he trusted the intelligence. He trusted his sailors. He trusted the strategy. Japan was coming, and America would meet them. The final march. By late May, Yamamoto's fleet was set in motion. 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, sailed with veteran pilots aboard. Behind them followed cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. To the north, a diversionary force aimed at the Aleutian Islands moved to split American attention. To the south, submarines waited to intercept US reinforcements. Japan believed everything was lined up perfectly, but overconfidence blinded them. They assumed the Americans would be late. Midway would fall quickly. Their carrier groups were unstoppable. Surprise was guaranteed. Yet the Americans already knew the day Japan would strike. June 4th. Midway's defenders waited. Pilots prepared. Deck crews fueled and loaded their aircraft. And across the Pacific, American carriers moved silently into position. Not behind the Japanese fleet, not miles away, but directly in front of them, hidden beyond the horizon. Japan was not walking toward victory. They were walking toward an ambush, one triggered, ironically, by the very mission meant to humiliate America. The Doolittle Raid hadn't just angered Japan. It set them on a collision course with their own destruction. Dawn broke on June 4, 1942, over a Pacific Ocean that looked calm and innocent. But hidden just beyond the curve of the horizon, two massive fleets were moving toward each other. One believing it was the hunter, the other preparing to become the executioner. Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, sailed confidently. These were the same elite ships and pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor. They carried Japan's best aviators, men who had trained for years in brutal programs with 30 to 60% washout rates. They were the finest carrier force in the world. But the United States had something Japan didn't know: foreknowledge, intelligence, timing, preparation, and most importantly, a burning determination fueled by Pearl Harbor and the recent Doolittle Raid. Japan believed the American carriers were far away. They believed Midway would be lightly defended. They believed their element of surprise was intact. Reality was about to crash into that belief with devastating force. The first sightings. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese carriers launched waves of bombers toward Midway. Their goal? Soften the island's airfields and defenses before the invasion forces arrived. As the Japanese aircraft roared toward their target, Midway's radar detected them. Alarms blared across the tiny atoll. Marines scrambled to their guns. Pilots sprinted to their cockpits. America wasn't caught off guard this time. As Japanese bombers descended onto the island, anti-aircraft guns erupted in a wall of fire. Tracer rounds cut across the sky. Flak bursts shook the bombers. Still, the Japanese pilots fought their way through it, dropping bombs and burning parts of the island. But before the Japanese strike waves even returned to their carriers, the first cracks in Japan's plan began to show. Because while the Japanese were busy attacking Midway, American scout planes were already finding the Japanese carriers. At 5:53 a.m., a PBY flying boat radioed the message that shook the Pacific. Enemy carriers sighted. Those three words sealed the fate of the Japanese fleet. Unlike Pearl Harbor, where America was caught sleeping, Midway was the exact opposite. American carriers were fully ready, fully armed, and strategically positioned. Nimitz had placed the U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, perfectly angled to strike. Japan didn't know they were there. They didn't know they had been spotted. They didn't know the Americans were already launching their own aircraft. But timing is everything in war. And now, timing would determine the course of the Pacific. The first American waves to reach the Japanese fleet were torpedo squadrons, slow, low-flying TBD Devastator aircraft. They flew without fighter cover. Most were outdated. Some were held together with patchwork repairs. But these pilots knew the stakes. They descended toward the Japanese fleet, flying barely above the ocean's surface, each plane aiming directly at Japan's elite carriers. And Japan's fighters, the deadly Zero squadrons, fell upon them. One by one, American torpedo bombers were shot out of the sky. Planes ignited in mid-air. Pilots crashed into the sea. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 planes, attacked without hesitation. 14 were destroyed. Only one survivor, George Gay, lived to tell the story. Torpedo Squadron 6, nearly all gone. Torpedo Squadron 3, the same fate. The sacrifice was unimaginable. It was brutal. It looked pointless. But it wasn't. Because while the Zero fighters chased the low-flying torpedo squadrons, they were pulled downward, away from the clouds above. And that exposed the Japanese carriers to the most important attack of the entire battle. From 20,000 feet above, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers began descending like hawks. Their pilots saw something that no American had ever seen before. 4 Japanese carriers below them, decks crowded with refueling aircraft, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the hangar floors. Why? Because as the torpedo squadrons attacked, Japanese commanders were frantically rearming and refueling their own planes for a second strike on Midway. Bombs, fuel lines, loaded aircraft, all sitting exposed at the worst possible moment. The torpedo squadrons hadn't scored a single hit, but they created the opening of the century. At 10:22 a.m., the sky opened. Dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown plunged downward in nearly vertical dives, engines screaming, airframes shaking as they accelerated. Below, Japanese sailors looked up in horror. Explosions tore through the flight decks, fuel ignited instantly, bomb racks detonated in chain reactions, firestorms erupted across the carriers. Kaga was hit, Akagi was hit, Soryu was hit. 3 carriers turned into towering infernos in less than 5 minutes. Japan's elite naval air arm, the same force that struck Pearl Harbor, was burning to death in front of their eyes. The Imperial Navy had never suffered a defeat like this. But the battle wasn't over. Only one carrier remained operational, Hiryu, and its commander wasn't giving up. Hiryu launched 2 brutal counterstrikes, both targeting the USS Yorktown. The Japanese pilots believed they sank her twice, and they almost did. Yorktown was battered, smoking, listing, but still afloat. Still, Hiryu stood alone against the combined might of the remaining American carriers. That afternoon, American dive bombers located Hiryu, and they sent her to the bottom. 4 Japanese frontline carriers. Gone. The heart of Japan's naval aviation. Gone. The pilots who trained for years. Gone in a single day. The Doolittle Raid had pushed Japan into this battle. Their pride demanded a decisive victory. Instead, Midway became the seismic defeat that changed Japan's destiny. The numbers were devastating. 4 carriers lost, 248 aircraft destroyed, Japan's best pilots killed. A blow from which their navy never recovered. Japan had no way to replace these losses quickly. Their pilot training program was slow and selective. Their aircraft production could not match American industry. Their supply lines stretched thin across the Pacific. Midway didn't just defeat Japan, it changed the entire balance of the war. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was no longer expanding, no longer dictating the pace, no longer feared as unstoppable. The initiative shifted, permanently, to the United States. And the spark that lit this entire chain of events was 16 bombers flying over Tokyo. Back in Tokyo, the news was suppressed. Reports sanitized, losses hidden. The emperor given only partial information. The Japanese public had no idea what truly happened at Midway, but the military leadership did. And inside their war rooms they understood with chilling clarity. The illusion of Japanese superiority had shattered. Japan had gambled everything on one battle, and lost everything that mattered. The Doolittle Raid had pushed them into action. Midway had pushed them into decline. Japan would fight on for 3 more years. But after Midway, they would never again fight from a position of strength. The tide had turned, and the Empire knew it. Midway was not just a defeat. It was the moment the Pacific War changed direction forever. Inside Japan's high command, the truth struck hard. Their era of easy victories was over. The Empire's expansion, once unstoppable, had slammed into an immovable wall. But the Japanese public didn't know any of this. News of the defeat was censored. Newspapers were ordered to print vague assurances. Radio broadcasts claimed tactical setbacks, nothing more. Yet behind the secrecy, panic spread quietly through the Imperial Navy. The 4 carriers lost at Midway weren't just ships. They were the backbone of Japan's offensive power, the most elite pilots, the most experienced air crews, the best mechanics, the most combat-hardened leaders, gone forever. Japan had counted on those very pilots to win a long war. Their training system was slow, strict, and unforgiving. It took years to create one elite carrier pilot, and Midway erased hundreds of them in a single day. Japan could replace planes, they could build new carriers, but they could never replace the men. The United States, on the other hand, began producing new pilots every month. By late 1942, America was graduating more aviators in a single class than Japan trained in an entire year. The imbalance was already becoming visible. Only weeks after Midway, Japanese commanders realized they had a new problem, a problem with a name, Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, US Marines landed on the island and seized a half-built Japanese airstrip. Japan was stunned. The Americans were no longer reacting, they were attacking. The airfield would soon be renamed Henderson Field, after a pilot killed at Midway. And with that landing, a brutal 6-month campaign began, one that bled Japan's resources dry. America could reinforce Guadalcanal endlessly. Japan could not. Every supply ship they sent came under attack. Every attempt to retake the island failed. Every night, American artillery thundered across the jungle. Japan threw thousands of young soldiers into the dense forests of Guadalcanal. Most never returned. The same navy that once dominated the Pacific now struggled to deliver food and ammunition to its starving troops. Japan's aura of invincibility vanished in the mud, sweat, blood, and malaria of Guadalcanal. The empire was now fighting the war it never wanted. A long war, a war of attrition, a war Japan could never win. While Japan scrambled to hold on to its remaining territory, the United States transformed itself into an industrial titan. New shipyards opened every few months. Massive factories roared day and night. Steel mills turned out weapons at rates the world had never seen. By mid-1943, America was launching one new aircraft carrier every month. Dozens of new destroyers and submarines were entering the fleet. Thousands of planes rolled out of assembly lines each week. Pilot training centers operated non-stop. Japan built slowly, carefully, expensively. America built relentlessly, endlessly, overwhelmingly. It wasn't even a contest. The chilling truth for Japan was this: every Japanese aircraft lost in combat weakened them. Every American aircraft lost replaced the same weak. Midway had shattered Japan's elite units. Guadalcanal broke their ability to replace them. American industry erased any hope of catching up. Japan wasn't losing the war on the battlefield alone. They were losing it on the factory floor. After Midway and Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy was forced into defensive operations. Their famous Zero fighters were now outclassed. American Wildcats, Hellcats, and later Corsairs cut through them in massive numbers. Japan's legendary battleships, Yamamoto and Musashi, rarely saw combat. They burned fuel Japan no longer had. They needed escorts Japan couldn't spare. Their guns meant nothing in a war now dominated by aircraft. By 1944, American carrier groups swept across the Pacific like a steel tide. Japan's once mighty navy was shattered. Carriers sunk air wings, decimated, fuel supplies critically low. And then came the blow Japan feared most, the Mariana Turkey Shoot. In June 1944, Japanese pilots, many with only weeks of training, were thrown into battle against fully trained American aviators. The result was catastrophic. The US shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in just 2 days. Japan's naval air arm, already weakened at Midway, now ceased to exist as a fighting force. Japan's defeat was no longer possible, it was inevitable. By late 1944, the war reached Japan's doorstep. American submarines destroyed the merchant fleet. Industrial cities suffered constant bombing. Food shortages grew severe. Civilians dug trenches, prepared bamboo spears, and trained for an invasion. And then, the nightmare scenario Japan once laughed off became reality. Hundreds of B-29 bombers began flying over Tokyo. The Doolittle Raid had once stunned Japan with 16 bombers. Now, the Americans were sending hundreds every week. Entire districts burned. Factories collapsed. Transportation networks shattered. Millions fled into the countryside. The empire that once dominated Asia now struggled to feed itself. Japan's leaders understood what the public did not. The war was lost. It had been lost for a long time, and the beginning of the end could be traced back to one moment, one raid, one spark that ignited the collapse. Japan's generals had once mocked America's weakness. They believed Americans had no resolve. They believed the US would negotiate or retreat. But after the Doolittle Raiders flew over Tokyo, after Midway, after Guadalcanal, after the industrial avalanche, after the bombing of Japan's cities, those same generals fell silent. The empire did not collapse because of one battle or one campaign. It collapsed because the raid they once dismissed forced them into a chain of decisions they were never prepared to make. Rushing the Midway operation, losing their elite pilots fighting a long war of attrition, underestimating American production, refusing to negotiate early, exhausting their navy in unwinnable battles. Japan never recovered from that momentum shift. The Doolittle Raid had not been militarily devastating, but it had been psychologically fatal. It shattered the illusion of invulnerability. It exposed cracks in Japan's planning. It forced them into reckless action. And it awakened a nation they had believed too weak to stand against them. 3 years later, as Japan lay in ruins, its cities burning and its empire gone, the truth became undeniable. Japan lost the war the moment they underestimated America, and the Doolittle Raid proved just how wrong they were. In April 1942, 16 American bombers flew over Tokyo. Japan laughed before they arrived. Japan panicked after they left. And Japan collapsed in the years that followed. The raid that seemed small. The raid that seemed symbolic. The raid that seemed impossible. Became the spark that ended the Japanese Empire. And the generals who once mocked America's weakness never laughed again.